just called me. All right, let's do this. Okay, I just wanted to teach you guys something interesting maybe today. Maybe, right? So I want to go over this and have a conversation about it. But this is just a paper that I'm writing with Brian Schrader, the guy who does sports nerds with me, and then Troy Morgan. You ever have a class with Troy here at all? He's a professor over in human performance and sport. Nobody? So we write about neoliberal scouting in post-free agency Major League Baseball. All right, so let me see if I can break this down into parts to make sense of it for you. We pretended to do this in our paper. So we have problem, cause, and then solution. Okay. So briefly, it used to be Major League Baseball that ownership would draft a player, and then you had the rights to the player for their entire life. You didn't have to do anything with them, right? You could pay them what you wanted. Of course, there was some arbitration. There were some negotiations, but for the most part, players didn't make any money. So to give you an idea of what I mean by that is,
practically indentured slavery.
what's up?
Practically indentured slavery.
Yes, for sure.
But they also love the sport.
They had to work jobs when the game was over. Like these dudes had jobs.
Right. But, like-
professional lacrosse stuff to do the same.
Mm-hmm.
But they did it because they loved playing. I mean, what was his name? The guy that was the director of can't think of his name. The one that first introduced the idea of the national team going to see the president. He worked on the Capitol Hill, but he
Yeah.
also loved playing baseball. And so this whole thing was okay. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. I guess I just assume that for a lot of these players, it's a job. Eventually, it just becomes a job. And so here's the story. We don't have to argue that one way or the other. 1976, the St. Louis Cardinals had traded. They tried to trade this guy named Curt Flood to the Philadelphia Phillies. Curt Flood was like amazing for the Cardinals. He was arguably the best position player they had. He was third on the team in WAR. WAR is wins above replacement, which basically means how good you are compared to the person who they put in your place if you were to be replaced. And he was behind only the two pitchers. Now I'm drawing a blank, but they're Hall of Famers, so I can't even think who it was. Two pitchers that he was behind. Anyhow, instead of being traded to the Phillies, he said, "Go to hell." He refused to be traded. He wrote a letter to Bowie Kuhn, who was Major League Baseball commissioner, and in some basically said it's not fair what you're doing. We're basically indentured slaves in a lot of ways, and you're treating us really shitty, and we're not okay with that. And so, in response, built a case. The case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually voted in favor of Major League Baseball and its owners. Said no, you could not have free agency. There could not be any kind of opening up of the marketplace of players. But eventually, it ended up a lot of other players got on board, and I think within 2 or 3 seasons later, free agency had begun. And what free agency basically means is that at the end of a contract, a player is able to go out and seek his value. I'm going to use very gendered terms here, right? Sorry about baseball. His value on the market. So if you're a very good player and the Rockies want to pay you more than the Dodgers, it is your right to go to the Rockies. The Dodgers no longer have any say over where you go, and you are a commodity, right, that is able to take control over his value and go out and seek that elsewhere. Now, if you wanted to go to a club who had a better chance of winning and you wanted to take less money, that is up to you too. But that conversation that we have about our athletes now is not a conversation we had 45 years ago. That was not a thing that existed. Free agency did not exist. So what we were particularly interested in this story, right, so this is a problem. Okay, so we'll write this up here, right? Is the introduction of free agency. And to give you an idea of how this changed player salaries, Jade, in 1976 and 77, Hank Aaron, arguably one of the top 5 greatest baseball players of all time, was making $150,000 roughly dollars a year. Within 3 years, Nolan Ryan was making $1.5 million. All right, so within 3 years, free agency just changed everything because ownership had the money to give to these players. They were putting it in their own pockets instead of actually paying the talent on the field. So that, right, I think to go back to
we
other
were talking
playing.
about the 1800s, sorry.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
The 1800s.
Yeah, the 1800s, right?
Yeah,
Before professionalization of baseball,
Yeah.
for sure. Now, I think that's the big issue, that in terms of all kinds of labor disputes, it's usually the owners, right? As Marx would say, those who have access or ownership of the means of production usually take all the money. So that's why you have to create a union, because the union shares that power between all the workers who are then able to stand up against ownership and try to get their fair share of that money, right? So now we're starting a revolution. Let's do it. All right, let's do it. There used to be a really good teachers union here, but that doesn't exist anymore. And if you are part of the teachers union, you're kind of looked down upon at this university. So that's anyhow. Okay, we can get into that someday over beers if you would like. So literally within 3 to 5 years, you see these salaries just explode. Nolan Ryan, again, being the kind of first professional baseball player to seriously take advantage of that and actually get value for what he was worth. Now, what this does is it changes, okay, all of, so the cause is, player choice causes this introduction of free agency and therefore increased risk, financial risk. Ownership now has the risk. Now, if you think about that, before free agency, players, all of the risk was on the players, everything. If you took a job in the off season and you got hurt by falling off a tractor, that was on you. You ruined your livelihood. Ownership had very, very little risk. Maybe the risk of building a stadium, right? Having a fan sue you for falling out of the stands or somebody choking on a hot dog or something like that. But the risk in terms of player management was all on the players, everything. Now you have the increased financial risk that is placed upon ownership because they are the ones who are investing in these bodies, in these players financially. So what does that do, right? It changes scouting. It changes scouting significantly to scouting. And we call it scouting and player development. So there's kind of this two-pronged change. There's a reason why sabermetrics becomes popular in the early 80s after the introduction of free agency. Does anybody know what sabermetrics is? Nobody? Nobody knows at all? Where's Key? I thought you would know. Lindy? Okay. Oh, fair enough. All right. Sabermetrics began by this dude. Bill James created Sabermetrics, and it was kind of this magazine, this journal that baseball nerds shared. It was often the guys that had, all the baseball cards in the world, and you would look at stats, you look at statistics. Well, what Bill James proved, right, in his kind of conceptualization of sabermetrics, right, Society of American Baseball Researchers is sabermetrics. S-A-B-R metrics. Society of American Baseball Researchers. And all this makes sense when I start talking about Brad Pitt and Moneyball. Whoops. Okay. So it's just kind of this niche area of baseball fans, guys and gals who would, share their calculations on baseball. And they were basically scientists in a lot of ways. And they would try to figure out, what's the correlation between the number of times a guy gets on base and the number of times he scores, right? What's that number? How does it change when you get a single in terms of your chance of scoring versus a double? How does it change maybe a pitcher who throws more ground balls as opposed to a pitcher who strikes out more people, right? What, in terms of those statistics, lead to more wins? So sabermetricians are the first, basically, data scientists who start putting all of this data together. They're running all kinds of calculations and algorithms, and they're trying to figure out what are these correlations between these very, very distinct stats. Because prior to free agency, prior to the beginning of advanced statistics in baseball, you had things like ERA, right? Earned run average, which is extremely easy to figure out. You know how to figure out ERA? Wendy?
How many runs are earned, average in the game?
Yeah. How many runs you would give up during a 9-inning game as a pitcher, okay? Pretty simple statistic. Home runs, pretty simple statistic. Runs batted in, very simple statistic. Runs, very simple statistic. Even slugging percentage, okay? Very, very simple statistic. Very, very simple statistic. Because all that means is of the percentage of the hits that you get, how many of them are more than one base hit, more than a single. Okay, that's your slugging percentage. Now we get the introduction of things like on-base percentage. What happens when I have a dude who's hitting 200, but he walks a ton? He gets on base all the time. Now, what does that mean in terms of a dude who steals? What is the value of his steal? Do I want a fast guy on my team? Does that matter? What is the risk of stealing? What is the risk of stealing and being thrown out at second worth the reward of taking second base? All of these things, sabermetricians begin to calculate and figure out. This is an external force, right? Sabermetricians had nothing to do with ownership in baseball. They were their own weirdo entity, right, that I consider myself a part of. They were out there. Nobody cared. Free ownership didn't care. They were still scouting. How many of you have seen, well, I guess, how many of you have seen Moneyball? 1, 2. There's that, you know, the old school scouts. It's all about the eye test and whether these guys pass the eye test, whether it looks like they throw hard, you know, are they built for baseball, all of that. What sabermetricians and eventually Moneyball goes to show is all of that is bullshit, right? All of that means nothing because you need data to prove this kind of thing. And so what that eventually, okay, through the likes of basically Billy Beane for the Oakland A's, he's the first, that's our mainstream, or our kind of central figure in this central character in this story is that's the first GM who really takes in sabermetrics kind of 15 years later as the evaluative tool for assessing talent. So it comes at two places, right? It changes scouting. So it literally changes, right? Going out and looking at a guy, trying to figure out whether or not he can add value to my team. I'm trying to manage financial risk here. So basically, can I sign a guy to a contract that is less than the value that I will get from him on my team? It becomes way, way different, right? It's a more kind of exact kind of science, beginning around the kind of mid-1990s for evaluating talent and investing in talent that you're going to be able to reward more benefit from, to get more value from, right? You're looking for surplus value. You're now applying economic thought to the evaluation of baseball players. And so the better, the more refined those measurements become, the less risk you can take on. So obviously it changes scouting. Okay, so now you're going to go off and you're going to teach scouts. Well, actually, scouts tend to just not matter, quite honestly. Billy Beane was a big proponent of college players. He liked to draft college players. Why would you want to draft college players? We're reviewing them through sabermetrics. Think about numbers and data and science.
So there is data on them.
What's up?
There is data.
There is data on them. Perfect, yes. College players have more data for you to analyze. They've played for 2 or 4 years. You can take all of that data and you can evaluate it. And at that level, you're getting much closer to the level we played in the minor leagues and the major leagues. There's also not a huge discrepancy between the two players that are facing each other, the pitcher and the hitter, right? Or the fielders behind the pitcher. Everybody's going to have a very similar level of talent, as opposed to high school baseball, where you may have one person, one dude, who's way, way better than anybody else in his conference. And for 30 games in a year, he's going to play against shit talent and shit pitchers, and he's going to hit 50 home runs. That doesn't matter if you're playing T-ball, right? It doesn't matter. That number that you get in terms of RBIs and home runs and all that, that's not a very good number. It's not a very valid or reliable number if you're going to be giving people tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars for signing bonuses. So if you watch Moneyball and you learn about Billy Beane, that's one of the first things he changed, right? I'm not going to give a bunch of money and a signing bonus to this player whom I know nothing about. He liked minor league players too. He would take minor league players because their body of work is larger. Their data is more easy data to evaluate. You can find trends, all of these things. So that changes scouting, okay? That changes how players are actually brought into an organization. You're limiting financial risk. You're limiting the risk that you're taking by signing a player, and you're trying to get as much value as possible from those players. This was a totally new concept when Billy Beane did it for the Oakland A's. So again, if you watch Moneyball, Billy Beane was hired as the GM. He's brought on. He has very, very little budget. We're not talking about the Yankees here. Okay, Major League Baseball has no salary cap. You know what that means? Anybody?
How much the team can spend.
Yeah, how much? Yeah, baseball doesn't have that, which is why the Yankees won for all those years in the '90s. Okay, and it's why the Dodgers. I don't know what the Dodgers should be winning, right?
The gap between
the Cubs finally won.
The gap between like the Yankees and like the Braves is like.
Huh?
And
It's like
Oakland at the
$200 million.
Exactly.
I think
Right.
one year, one player on the Yankees made more money than the entire roster on one of the smaller teams.
Right. Okay, so a team like that. So let's go back to financial risk. A team like the Yankees or the Dodgers, and yes, my beloved Cubs, right? People always talk about the Cubs being the level of losers. The Cubs have always had money, a shitload of money. They've just been really bad at selecting talent. That's why bringing on Theo Epstein changed everything, and then having Joe Madden on the field to manage that talent changed the entire scope of the Cubs, building a farm system, all that stuff. Anyhow, the Yankees, they were able to have a lot of misses, if you think about it. They got Alfonso Soriano for way too much. They got, Robinson Cano, you could argue, for too much. Johnny Damon, if you remember that, probably way too much for Johnny Damon. I'm trying to think who else have they overpaid for? Oh, come on now. They always get, who have the Yankees overpaid for recently? I mean, some of their pitchers in the 90s just ended up being total flops. They were terrible. They can take that risk. They have all kinds of money in their coffers to take that risk. And so literally from the 80s into the 90s, they had, the Oakland A's, before they went broke, they could take that risk. They could absolutely take that risk because they weren't they weren't concerned with the financial risk that they were taking because they had all this money that they were just generating for people going to games, selling merchandise, all of this. Now, the Oakland A's, when Billy Beane gets introduced as their GM, that's a totally different story. They don't have all the money in the world. They're arguably the second biggest team in the Bay Area, right? People love the Giants. The A's, right, they play in the Coliseum. It's a really terrible place to play. It's kind of, you're in Oakland, right, which is already kind of the B city out of the Bay Area, right? Maybe even after Mendocino, right? Like it could be 3, okay? No, I'm just kidding. Beautiful. They say, okay, give us a contender, but we're only going to give you X amount of dollars. Which I would like to know what their salary was, what their salary collection was in that year.
It was really, really low. I just saw the movie actually.
You did? Okay. So they bring in, what's Jonah Hill's character, Paul? You know what I'm talking about? That guy. They basically bring in a statistician and a mathematician to evaluate all the players in the A's system. And they try to figure out, using sabermetrics and advanced statistics, who can we bring up to put into our lineup that will give us the best chance to win? So what happens is you see the A's getting
Peter Brand.
Peter Brand. Okay. All right. There's somebody else too. I can't remember. He's with the Browns now. I can't think of his name. Paul something. The A's make all these weird ass choices during that year. What was it? 2001?
Yeah.
Okay, 2001. They go out and they get David Justice. I don't know if you remember. You may remember David Justice. He dated Halle Berry for a while. He was amazing, right? Borderline Hall of Famer, played for the Braves for many, many years, put up fantastic stats. He's on the ass end of his career, okay? And the A's bring him in. Billy Beane brings him in because they get him for cheap. And they knew exactly what he could do. And they only put him in situations, in games, in which he did that thing. And so what happens is over the course of, remember, sabermetricians are all about data. This is why the playoffs are different. I want the group of people, the group of guys, the 25-man roster that is going to give me the highest win percentage, the highest number of wins over 162 games. So for that year, Billy Beane and the A's build that team. They make the playoffs, right? You remember they went on, 21-game win streak. It was pretty crazy. It was wild, all of this shit. They get to the playoffs, and they fizzle out. And again, the idea is a playoff is a 5-game series or a 7-game series. Your data right? Your collection of data, your data set is smaller. You can have a guy hit, go on a 7 at bat streak, okay, in which he gets no hits. Now, even in the regular season when he hits 300, but those 7 at bats over the course of 2 or 3 games, that's the entire series. It's over. So that's why the argument goes, the A's fizzled out, Moneyball doesn't work when you're talking about playoffs, because each game is its own tiny little sample size, and ideally you have to have talent in order to win that sample size. You have to have pitching, all of this stuff, until Tony La Russa came to ruin fucking everything, right? Which is basically slowing the game down, and he applied sabermetrics to choosing his pitchers. Now, I don't know if none of you really watch baseball, probably as much as Wendy and I do, but every playoff series that Tony La Russa was a part of in the 2000s took forever, because he would stop and make pitching decisions based on advanced statistics that he got about who was batting and who was pitching. And so if he knew that Jade was really bad with side armors who threw from the left side of the mound, then he would put in for one at bat that side armor who threw from the left side of the mound to get Jade out, and that would be it. And he would just change because Larry's up next, and Larry's really bad with power pitchers who throw right-handed power pitchers. So now you have the slowing down of the game, because Tony La Russa is using all of this data in order to basically not so much eliminate financial risk, but eliminate the risk of losing in that particular situation. So that changes the game, that changes scouting, but there's this additional element of, any questions actually, by the way? Any questions?
33 million was Oakland's salary that year.
How much?
33.
33 million? That's insane. Who was the highest that year?
801. I don't know.
Probably the
Oh,
Yankees.
the Yankees.
250 million or something. I mean, that's insane to me. Like, that's crazy. That's like you're getting college baseball players that have no talent.
The
Right.
Yankees were 190.
109. That's crazy. Anyhow, okay. So there's scouting. There's obviously the changes in the game. That's one thing. But another thing is player development. And so what you begin to see, especially over the last, I would say 10 to 15 years, probably 10 years, is there's a change in how players are developed. And so the science of like weightlifting has changed. So you used to be, you would go and you had to lift weights maybe every 3 days or something like that. And it was thought that weightlifting was one way of making you a better pitcher or a better position player. Or, you would have a guy throw a bullpen session 2 days before the game, and you would throw X amount of pitches, and you just assume for every guy that was the same strategy to preparing them for their start in 2 days. Well, what player development has shown is that you actually you can't just scout players differently based on advanced statistics, but you have to treat each player differently in how they develop based on advanced metrics and advanced statistics. So things like, which is kind of odd, but we're beginning to see it now in terms of pitch count. So it's thought let's say 1994, that pitchers could just throw like 150 pitches in a game and that was fine, right? Because Nolan Ryan did it, and he'd throw like 190 pitches and be fine. Now that doesn't mean that Evelyn can throw 190 pitches and be fine, because her arm may tire out at 105 pitches, right? Or Zach, your arm might tire out at 95 pitches. But the only way to know that is basically to look at the history of statistics and data that come from Evelyn and come from Zach in order to figure out when does their velocity go down, right? When does the break on their fastball or their curveball stop? When does it stop breaking as much? Now I'm using an entire history of your known performances to evaluate when to pull you from the game, right? Or how often to throw you prior to your start. Or if you're a hitter, when do you get tired? At what point in the season do you get tired? If I know that, let's say, Jade gets tired on, it looks like kind of middle of June, she kind of goes in a slump. Well, that means that maybe I don't have Jade take as many cuts in batting practice in April, May, but also for spring training. You're not going to play as many games, right? I'm just going to assume that you're going to be ready. You're not going to play as many games. It changes everything. Now, what we argue, we should add a section about this, is that player development and that element of it is actually the cause of PED use. We argue that, we might think about it as players understanding that they are in charge of what is called human capital, okay? This is a neoliberal economic theory. It's the idea that as opposed to a factory owner having capital in the form of machines, but also, people right? That was capital. The means of distribution, all these very clear, tangible things. Neoliberalism argues that those in power need to actually add value to human capital through very, very kind of different, nuanced means. And so things like education become human capital, ways to build human capital. I know that a player who takes a class on risk management is actually going to make better decisions on the field, or they're going to make better decisions off the field. It's going to prevent them from getting arrested. Or I know that if I draft this player who comes from a troubled background, that paying for his family to move to Cincinnati with him is actually going to lower the risk that player ends up, doing a bunch of drugs and overdosing. Right? That's an investment in human capital. That's an investment in the person himself. That sounds really nice on the surface, and it is, right? It's great, but it's also there's a financial element to it, right? There's a desired outcome that goes with that. Now, human capital is not just the person investing in the capital itself, himself, but it's actually the person himself investing in himself. As we've got to talk about that. So we now, according to neoliberalism, the economic position, the economic moment that we live in, we live in a moment in which we are responsible for investing in ourselves, for building our own human capital. We are charged with building our own worth because, it used to be a good way to think about this is if you're expected to go to college. You're expected to go to college and get a degree and make yourself more valuable. Think about how you talk about your friends who don't go to college, or think about how they're viewed in society. They're often looked down upon. It's not a 4-year degree. It's not even a technical degree. Oh, you didn't go to college? That becomes a governing principle in itself. It becomes rhetorical. It becomes persuasive. You're not going to take the time and the effort and the energy and the money to invest in yourself. Then if you don't succeed in the open marketplace of baseball or life, that responsibility is yours, not mine, not the state, not the central government, not your parents. That is on you. That is a complete change in how we view citizenry and governance in the United States since over the last, prior to 1970. Okay, think about like the welfare state. Post-World War II politics and high taxation and all these things that we attribute to New Deal economics, right? The government took tax money and would basically give it out to people in hopes that those people would do their best with it, right? There was a support system there. There was a safety net. With neoliberalism, that safety net goes away, and the responsibility is all on the individual to basically build value for himself or herself. And so if you can't build value, then it is your then it's your fault that you fail. That is, in a lot of ways, neoliberalism in a nutshell. You're building value off, if we want to go back to risk, right? Because risk is key here. You're building value in order to limit the risk that you have in the open marketplace. Now, questions. I hope you all understand this because I want you to all understand this. This is quite interesting to me. Yeah, questions? You all get it?
Yeah.
Nailed it. Gosh. Does that make sense?
What are you writing this for?
A journal article. Cool.
Should you publish?
Yeah, trying to get tenure. Yeah. There's actually a really fascinating.
So what's your conclusion?
We're just observing it. Right? We're saying that post-free agent player, what do we call it? Player procurement. It's the combination of these two things. Is an example of neoliberal economic practice. We're just pointing that out, that's all academics do. Right? Like if somebody in baseball would read that, they'd go, "Yeah, you're right. Thanks." Like so, that's
So you guys don't have any persuasion or anything like that?
no. It's just an observation for the most part. But nobody's really said it before, though. So I guess that's why it's different.
That's a really good observation.
But no, we're. I don't know what the problem is. I guess there will be a takeaway, right? That's when we say, okay, there's an issue with this. Well, what happens when this bleeds outside of baseball, and now it's how you evaluate talent for your business? right? And now it's I'm collecting as much data about you in order to see whether or not you're going to quit your job. Which is funny because that's what Troy does. He actually has they created a questionnaire for grit, for measuring grit. And grit, like he'll eventually be able to sell this questionnaire for who knows how much money, right? To companies, to employers that basically measure grit. Are you able to persevere in difficult situations? Are you able to, what are some of the other things? Like that's probably the best. Are you able to persevere in difficult situations?
So I guess I have it doesn't really have to do with your sports article, but when you're talking about how going to college and that's supposed to give you the upper hand, a lot of times, especially now in society, it's you going out and working in the workforce is what actually gives you the upper hand, and college is kind of like a secondary.
No, it's changed, right? What is the value of college? Is the risk of debt
Right.
worth the outcome?
Especially depending on your degree.
Right. Absolutely, right? That's something you have to consider. Now, the thing is, what makes this different is that is not a choice that you had to make 100 years ago. That's not a choice that even existed. And so actually, with the introduction of that choice works rhetorically or persuasively or as a form of governance to actually make you a better citizen or guide you one way or the other towards being a better person, whatever that means.
But
Right?
yeah, really what is a better worker nowadays?
I know.
The person who works harder and doesn't get the privileges, or the person who takes the privileges and doesn't know how to work?
And that's a decision.
So then how does that apply to your baseball theory?
Is it worth, is it worth the risk of taking HGH and getting caught if I know that I'm going to make $25 million a year for the next 2 years? That's what these players make this decision. I would argue everybody who's been caught over the last 5 years, that's a decision they make. It's rampant in minor league baseball because minor league baseball players go, okay, I'm going to take steroids for 1 year. If that 1 year is going to give me a contract for $10 million, I'm set for life. I'm willing to take that risk to get caught to make that money. That's the same kind of choice of a college student deciding whether or not to go to college or where to go to college and that kind of risk. But all that risk is now on us as individuals and not some larger governing body.
How much does it cost them once they get caught with HGH?
Nothing. I'm sure some of them it's probably in their contracts where they lose some money.
Some
But whatever money is made by then.
Exactly. So
Exactly.
why not take the risk?
That's my argument. Why wouldn't they take the risk? Right? There needs to be higher. I don't know. Baseball
Do you
needs
ever
to
watch
fix itself.
Ballers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so true. Why not take the risk? Or anymore, it's not so much to get stronger. It's for your body to recover faster.
And endurance.
Right.
Yeah.
Endurance, for sure. So of course they're going to, if I know that I'm going to make, if I've got a $5 million bonus, if I start 35 games this year, as opposed, if I get to that point, I start 35 games, why wouldn't I take HGH in order to make myself recuperate faster? But think about the narratives then that surround these players. Think about how the media covers them, right? They're bad people. They're jerks, right? They're cheaters, right? All this stuff.
But then there's also I don't know if you've been following the news, but that recent football player who beat the crap out of his girlfriend or had someone come in and stage a robbery to get all of his stuff back and beat her almost to death. Did you hear about that?
Yes. LaShawn McCoy.
Yeah. With him, it's like all of the stories that are coming out afterwards are about how he's very abusive, which is definitely a sign of taking steroids. So is it the money that you're willing to take versus you being a stable human being?
So wait, you're thinking steroids make you unstable?
Well, yeah, a lot.
HGH, right? Steroids make you crazy. These guys aren't. Baseball players aren't on steroids.
Oh,
It's all
okay.
HGH.
So it's just
Human growth
football
hormone.
players.
Do they still take steroids? Steroids are bad for you.
Yeah.
Steroids are bad, but HGH isn't.
But in the 80s, players were taking meth, basically, right?
Right.
Doing amphetamines to see the ball. So
Pregnant
There's
moms
always-
were doing it as well
Yeah,
to make sure that they could be housewives at the same time.
It'd be interesting, it's probably not been done, but so this analytics has been going on for 20 years. What is the old scouting where you did an eye test and a psychological test and scouted the players, how many of them, I'd say on a team, were successful versus the analytics? I don't think, I assume there's never been a study that a team says, okay, we've been doing this for 10 years, of what we've chosen, how many of the players have been a success and what's been a failure for the
The
analytics.
Cubs won.
What's interesting, Larry, that's true, but I think what this changes is it's not so much the players, one player, as it is the collective. It's the pieces of the puzzle, right? Like,
So you look at the Cubs, you're saying.
I think so, in a lot of ways. And then I want to make the argument, I like to see some advanced data on this, it doesn't really exist. The playoffs is when a manager really comes in, right? Is when a coach really comes in, because a coach now has to use that data to make decisions in a split second. Because over 162 games, you can fuck up here, and it'll be fine. You may lose this game, but you'll win the next 4. You're learning, you're collecting data on yourself. And I would argue in a lot of ways that, Joe Madden is that coach for a playoff run. I would argue the Dodgers lost because, Dave Roberts, he was out-coached, he was out-managed in a lot of ways. He doesn't. Tony La Russa's a genius. It was very boring to watch a Cardinals game, but the man was a genius. He knew exactly what he was doing. People hate that, but it's interesting. The same, the Spurs are doing a very similar thing. They're taking advanced statistics. The Warriors have done that. The Warriors, they've spread the court. They realized the 3-point shot is a better. Yes, I may not make the same percentage at a 3-point shot as I would for an 18-footer, but the reward on that percentage is higher than the reward on those 18-footers, which is really, there's no center anymore. There's no need for a center. I want to say one last thing, just to kind of hear what you guys think about it. There is a company in, I think it's Boston. Brian showed me the article years ago. We write a little bit about it. Who now offers services to major league teams in which they put a cap on a guy's head and they measure his brain responses to the seams of a baseball, with the idea that I can't teach your brain to respond faster. I can teach you to hit. I can't teach you to respond faster. And so it's all about response time. And so actually when the Red Sox drafted Mookie Betts, I think in like the 12th round, the dude's an MVP, they did it based on that. His response time, he could just see the seams of a baseball faster than anybody else. Like, that's crazy to me. But it's true, right? Like, you can teach the physicality of it. I can't teach your brain to work faster. That's pretty amazing. It is. But, now that I read an article of Matt Ryan, he invested in a company that does something similar for quarterbacks, like reading, you're sitting there in front, you're reading defenses, like how fast can you read defense? And they're going to draft a guy based on that, with the idea that then you can teach a dude to throw a football, which I don't know, you kind of can. I would assume, unless you're Tim Tebow, then you can. But I don't know. This is just to go back to Jade's question. What's the significance of this? It's again, what happens when this is now applied to the workforce, is applied to our relationships with other people, is applied to the non-sports world. It's going to happen. Employers do this. Employers evaluate talent. They want to limit the risk. But what happens if you start doing this, based on who you're going to date, right? I want to date you, but I want to see, what are your chances? I want to see what your chances of getting pregnant are. Like, think about that. Like, that's a very realistic thing. You're in love with somebody, but you know what? On this level of your assessment, right? Sorry.
But isn't it already kind of like that?
Yeah. Wouldn't you say?
Yes.
That's what online dating allows for in a lot of ways. You're limiting risk. The risk of heartbreak, wasted time. Yeah.
You're also talking about like catfishing and everything else that goes on with online in general. So that heartbreak, I feel like a lot of times happens faster or more intensely or like more often when you're doing online versus like meeting someone in public and like actually getting to know them.
Yeah. So we're not all becoming Spock, is what you're saying?
Yeah, basically.
We're not there? I don't know, this is fun stuff to me. What was I was reading something. The dumbest sport is hockey in terms of this. Hockey doesn't, like, it was Malcolm Gladwell has a really good podcast called Revisionist History. But there was a segment a couple weeks ago in which he talked for maybe 5 to 10 minutes about advanced stats in hockey. And of course, there are a couple Canadian professors who are like, okay, here's how we could revolutionize the game. And one of the statistics they said is that if you're down by 1 goal, you should pull your goalie at 10.5 minutes in the third, because that is when your chances to tie the game are at its highest. You're going to have the highest amount of time to tie the game. But what's crazy is if you go down 2 goals, you still keep the goalie out. 3 goals, because your chances, right, are never going to increase in tying the game if you put somebody back in. So, but imagine if a hockey coach were to do that, like to pull the goalie at 10.5 minutes, the fans would go nuts. But it makes sense, right? Or they talk about pulling the goalie to start the game. What if you started the game by pulling the goalie? Your chance to immediately take the lead would go it would be crazy. Right? Soccer is also very hard to measure, apparently, because I don't know why. I should have read the article better. Right now, the advanced statistics really only value the players who score, which in soccer, it's yes, you need dudes who score, but so much of it is just your midfielders who kind of facilitate everything. But there's not really a way to measure their value yet. We'll get there. It's fascinating. But okay, any questions about this? We'll meet in the editing bay on Wednesday, and we'll go through. Bring your audio. I'll try to bring some audio too. I'll try to record the podcast before that, and I'll just walk through and edit mine. You guys can watch me. I'll answer questions, and then we'll see where we stand for that class. Sound good? Yeah. All right, everybody. Have a great day.